Hi class, how are you doing? We're going to start studying the Cold War as it relates to Central and South America. And remember these keys that you can use. You can pause the video and go backwards or forward and look at your test questions as you're going through the assignment. I would suggest you bring your test up on one side and the PowerPoint here, the video on the other side, and answer the questions as you go through, but that's up to you. So we're going to study now, this is called Cold War 18, it's called Neighbors. And it's all about our South and Southern and Central American neighbors. And some of these pairs, the Soviet Union for a long time wanted to have bases in the Cuba. You know, they put the missiles in Cuba, which is just 90 miles from America's soil. But all these countries in South America, there were always been a lot of upheaval and turmoil and revolutions and people dissatisfied with the government. A lot of poverty there. And so the Soviets used that, the Russians used that. They wanted to have bases in Central and South America, and they kept trying to get into there, and Castro was helping them. And so this is our battle with the communism in the Central and South America during the Cold War. That's what this is really about, America's fight with the Soviet Union and communism during those years. So, Guatemala. Let's talk about Guatemala first. The United States has a long-standing policy called the Monroe Doctrine. This is an important thing for you to understand. The Monroe Doctrine said that European countries should not meddle in the affairs of the nations of the Americas. It was put in there to keep Europeans from taking control of South American countries, like the French tried to take control of Mexico, like Spain was trying to control Cuba, and we were against European countries coming in and trying to take control of our neighbors in Central and South America. So the U.S. reasoned that countries that became communist would be under the control of the Soviet Union, and therefore, as was in the case of Cuba. The U.S. felt that enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, it was preventing the European country, Russia, from taking control of the nations of the Americas, and Russia wanted to take control. Central America, the Caribbean, and South America became battlegrounds for the battle between the United States and the USSR, that's Russia, as the Cold War comes to America's backyard. After World War II, the growing nationalism in Central and South America, I mean putting our country first, led to greater resentment against the United States, whose government and business interests dominated the region. The United States had a lot of investments in there. We had investments in oil, we had investments in the fruit, plantations and things, and we were importing a lot of stuff from Central America, and we had some American businessmen owned property there. So in 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was voted Guatemala's president. Arbenz wanted to modernize Guatemala's backyard society, and he started a land reform program, you know, like the communists always do. They have a land reform, right? But land reform means that they nationalize thousands of acres of land. They take it away from private citizens, and some of the private citizens he was taking land away from was owned by the United Fruit Company, an American company. So officials in Washington were alarmed and suspected the communist infiltration of the Arbenz government. Arbenz, he was the communist leader there. He said he wasn't a communist, and the curriculum says he wasn't a communist, but boy, he was pretty close to it. The CIA organized an operation called PB Success, which mobilized disaffected Guatemalan exiles and peasants into action. The PS Success campaign brought down Guatemala's government and drove Arbenz and his wife into exile. Some 9,000 of his supporters were arrested. Among those who fled to Guatemala was a young Argentine doctor named Che Guevara, who went to Mexico, where he met Cuban rebel leader Fidel Castro. So here's your questions, okay? What country controlled large parts of Guatemala economy during the Cold War? Well, the United States did. It was the United Fruit Company of Boston. So why did American officials suspect that Jacobo Arbenz might be a communist? And you have to answer that question. Why did the CIA help to bring down the Guatemala government? And what was the name of the U.S. policy that said Europeans had to stay out of the American hemispheres? We know what that is. That's the Monroe Doctrine, D. Let's go on to the next lesson. Now here you see some of the characters involved in this. You got Che Guevara's up on the top left. You got Fidel Castro, and then of course you got Soviet Union and Fidel Castro in unity. Now at Cuba, that's what we're going to talk about now. By the end of the 1950s, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara had triumphed in Cuba, establishing a communist regime that soon allied itself with the Soviet Union. In 1961, the new U.S. President John F. Kennedy inherited a CIA scheme to send an army of exiles to Cuba to overthrow the Castro government. The plan had been worked up during the Arbenz either against Arbenz in Guatemala, but the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion against Castro was a disaster. Remember, we talked about that previously when we talked about Cuba. When America tried to finance these rebels to go and take back Cuba from Castro, and he somehow got word of the invasion ahead of time. He knew where they were coming, and he was just waiting for them to and he just wiped them out. Anyway, that's another story. Anyway, after defeating the U.S.-backed forces, Castro wanted to take armed revolution into Central and South America. By the early 60s, the left-wing groups were fighting the authorities in Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru. The United States grew very nervous, so in 1965, the U.S. Marines were sent into the Dominican Republic to end the democratic revolution that Washington believed was backed by Cubans. And it was. And it wasn't a very democratic revolution. Cuba's real efforts to exploit revolution, meanwhile, met with mixed results. And in 1967, Che Guevara, who had called up for 100 Vietnams, he wanted all the countries to be like Vietnams against America. He was captured alive in the jungles of Bolivia, and then he was shot, and he was dead hours later. So he was captured by the CIA, and he was executed. So, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were the threat to the U.S. Why were they a threat to the U.S.? Many Americans had helped Fidel Castro come to power in Cuba and were shocked to learn that he was a communist. What did Castro do after he took power in Cuba? What did he do after he took power? When Che Guevara called for 100 Vietnams, what was he saying? He wanted the United States were having trouble in Vietnam, or we're not winning that war, so he wanted us to have 100 Vietnam wars to fight at the same time. And why did President Eisenhower, question 8, set Marines into the Dominican Republic? And you can look up the answer. Now, you can look up all those answers just by going back and looking at the text. They all come from there. Okay? All right, let's go to the next assignment. Now we're going to talk about Chile. Chile had been here you see Chile is on the west coast of South America. Now, Chile had been calm in the 1960s, but by 1970, a left-center coalition sought victory. And Unidad, a popular was led by a Marxist doctor, Salvador Allende. He was a communist, a Marxist communist. U.S. businesses and the CIA were tried but failed to prevent Allende from being elected president of Chile. Allende's first big step was the nationalization of the copper mines. And copper was an important mineral that America needed and other countries needed. It's a very important mineral and Chile had a large supply of the world's copper in their mines. Chile's biggest industry, which was still effectively under the U.S. control, he pressed on with what he called the social revolution. Chilean peasants began to seize land. The Chilean economy was increasingly put under state control, a move that upset overseas financiers. The World Bank cut off credit to Chile. He was nationalizing, which communists usually do when they take over a country. They take over all the industries and the farming. Inflation and economic problems mounted, and the CIA money helped to pay for Chilean truck owners to bring the country to a standstill. At the United Nations, Allende accused telecommunications conglomerate AT&T of trying to provoke a civil war. On September 11, 1973, Allende was violently ousted by the head of the military, General Augusto Pinochet. He was a military leader. Allende was found dead after the Moneda, and the presidential palace had been set ablaze. Following the coup, Pinochet had hundreds of political suspects rounded up. Many were never seen again. So you had one person revolted, the communists on the left, and then General Pinochet took over and kicked out Allende. That's the main thing you have to remember from this. So the events in Chile after Allende took power most closely resemble the events in what? After somebody took something. It's what you have to answer up here. The Marxist economic policies under Allende were what? During the Cold War, civil unrest and Marxist leaders brought many countries under the control of the communist governments that eventually became client states of the Soviet Union. The U.S. saw what was happening in Chile, and they were happy when who took control and brought the pro-Western government to who took control in Chile. In other words, who was the guy that took control after Allende was kicked out? Okay, now, guys, after. You have to understand that when a country takes over, usually when the Soviet Union or a country goes communist, it never goes the other way. They'll have an election and people will vote in communism, and that's the last election they have. Once the communists take over, they don't let go very easily. The philosopher who developed the modern communists was Karl Marx. Those leaders who described themselves as Marxists were assumed by the U.S. to be communists. Which of the people below describe themselves as Marxists? Which one? Chile is a country in... Where's Chile? What continent is it on? Well, of course, it's in South America. Let's go on to the next one now. Central America. In the 1930s, in Nicaragua, U.S. Marines helped to put dictator Somoza into power. He was a dictator in Nicaragua. 40 years later, Nicaragua was still ruled by Somoza. After years of fighting, guerrillas who called themselves Sandinistas, after the name of the 1930s anti-U.S. rebel, ousted Somoza in 1979. Somoza was kicked out and the Sandinistas took control. Daniel Ortega was the head of this. The Sandinistas allied themselves with Cuba and attempted to bring Marxist or communist order into the country. But they found themselves being challenged by a counter-revolution called the Contras. The Americans started to finance a bunch of guys, said, we want to go back and take our country back from the Marxists in Nicaragua, and the United States financed them. They were called the Contras. At the same time, in neighboring El Salvador, protests had broken out against the right-wing military rule. Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero was among those who spoke out. In March 1980, as he was saying Mass in a private chapel, the Archbishop was assassinated. At Romero's funeral, mourners were fired upon, and many died. Later in the years, 3 U.S. nuns and females lay workers were kidnapped, raped, and killed by men who discovered to be part of El Salvador's Nationalist Guard. The U.S. briefly and temporarily withdrew aid to Salvadoran military. Meanwhile, the Salvador guerrillas expanded their campaign against the government. One of the reasons the U.S. was concerned about Marxist revolutions in Central and South America was the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is America's link between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. was concerned that the Soviets would control the traffic between the Atlantic and the Pacific by taking over the Panama Canal, which the United States built. And certainly the communists probably would have done that. It would have given them a lot of leverage with that. So what are the questions here? What was the name of the Marxist rebel who fighting against the government in Nicaragua? What was the name of the U.S. leader in Nicaragua who was trying to fight off the Marxist rebels? What was the name of the counter-rebel group fighting against the Sandinistas? What did the U.S. do in response to the killing of the 3 nuns in El Salvador in 1980s? And the U.S. believed that what could control shipping in the Caribbean if local communists were to take control in the Central American governments. So they were afraid who was going to take control of the canal is what they're asking in question 18. All right, now engagement. As the fighting continued in Central America, it was getting really hot down there, all the fighting that was going on. As the fighting continued in Central America, Washington was planning another operation on the British-governed Caribbean island of Grenada. When Grenada's left-wing Prime Minister Maurice Bishop was assassinated by extreme Marxists in 1983, the U.S. military had an invasion plan already from Ronald Reagan's approval. The Marxists were building an airfield that could accommodate Soviet military airplanes, and the U.S. believed that it was an attempt to establish Soviet military base in the Caribbean. Reagan sent Marines. So what the Soviets were doing, they took over this island of Grenada, their Marxist puppet did, and they were going to build big airplanes and have big Soviet bombers with nuclear weapons landing very close to the United States. Reagan said, no, you ain't. And so Reagan sent the Marines into Grenada, and with the invasion in weekly, they opposed by a group of Cuban advisors on Grenada, it was over in a few days. Within 6 weeks, the invasion was a success, and American troops left Grenada. Now, the Reagan administration was also funding Nicaragua's Contra rebels. At first, the U.S. Congress supported the Contras, but then they cut off aid to them. The Reagan administration believed that it was wrong to send Contras into battle and then withdraw support from them. We were sending these guys out to fight, and then we took away their support. An aide to Ronald Reagan named Oliver North came up with an idea to support the Contras. Here's what he did. This is the Iran-Contra thing. He sold military supplies to Israel. See, Congress says, we cannot support the Contras anymore. You can't support them. You can't give them money. You can't give them arms. So we did have good relations with Israel. So Oliver North came up with this idea. He says he sold military supplies to Israel, who then sold the supplies to Iran. Then Oliver North then used the money to buy military supplies for the Contras. So he sold military weapons to Israel, which we were allowed to do, and then Israel sold them to Iran and got the money, and then we used the Iran money to finance the Contras in Central America. The affair became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Congress held hearings on the matter, but the American public clearly supported Colonel North. So I remember the hearings. I watched them live, the whole thing, and the whole country. First, it looked like they were going to go against the Reagan administration, but by the end of the hearings, everybody was cheering Oliver North as a hero. By 1990, Nicaragua agreed to open the free elections, and the Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega asked the Nicaraguan people to elect him president. His opponent was Violeta Chamorro, the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, an opposition leader killed during the Somoza regime. And when the voters were tallied, Chamorro, she was a woman, she won a narrow yet stunning victory. The superpower struggle in Central America had given way to a quiet revolution at the ballot box, and the government opposed to communism had won. So when they finally was put up to an election, the anti-communist Chamorro beat Daniel Ortega, for the United States and for the West. Now, here's your test questions here, and it's all the questions. Why did the U.S. invade Grenada? Why do we want to do that? We were afraid of those airplanes, remember? Who was funding the Nicaragua Contra rebels? Who was funding the Contras? Well, Ronald Reagan was, the Reagan administration. Question 21. What was the money from the Iran-Contra scandal used for? 22. Who was president of the U.S. during most of the 1980s? Of course, Ronald Reagan was. And 23. What country was not involved in the Contra scandal? Cuba was the only one not involved there, really. Iran, because they were Israel. We sold the arms to Israel. Then Iran picked them up, and then we got the money for the Contras. So Cuba was not really involved in that Iran-Contra deal. 24, when the people of Nicaragua were given a chance to vote for a government of their choice, they elected. Who did they elect? Who was the person or persons who conceived and called out the Iran-Contra deal? Who was the guy that came up with that idea for the Iran-Contra deal? Well, gracias por su atención. Usted es una gran clase. I hope I'm saying this right. I hope my Hispanic friends will maybe correct me on my Spanish, but anyway, I thought I'd put the goodbye in Spanish. You're doing a good class. I really like you guys. Keep up the good work, okay?